There comes a point in every soul's journey when the need for closure begins to dissolve. It doesn't happen through a single moment of clarity or a final conversation that neatly ties the past together. It happens slowly, quietly, like fog lifting from a valley after a long night. One day you wake up and realize you no longer need answers. You no longer crave the apology that never came, the explanation that was withheld, or the validation that someone else could never give you. You simply stop waiting. And in that stillness, you meet freedom. Closure is something we often chase because our minds fear uncertainty. We want stories to end neatly. We want to understand why things unfolded the way they did, who was at fault, and how to make sense of the pain. We mistake understanding for healing. Yet the truth is, some stories were never meant to be explained, only accepted. Some doors stay closed, not because you failed to open them, but because what lies behind them no longer belongs to you. At first, the absence of closure feels like unfinished business. It keeps the heart restless. The mind replays conversations, imagines different endings, or writes messages that will never be sent. But over time, something within you shifts. You begin to see that your peace is far too precious to be held hostage by another person's silence. You stop trying to decode someone's behavior or rewrite what already happened. You start to understand that healing doesn't come from knowing their reasons. It comes from releasing your need to know at all. When you stop chasing closure, you begin to reclaim your power. You recognize that the other person's inability to give you answers says nothing about your worth. It reveals only their own limits, their fear, their avoidance, their unreadiness to face the truth. And so you stop seeking meaning in their absence. You stop standing at the door of someone who already walked away. You start walking toward yourself. Freedom comes the moment you realize that closure was never something to receive, it was something to create. It lives in the quiet act of acceptance. It lives in the breath you take when you finally say, this chapter doesn't need to make sense for me to move forward. You stop asking, why did this happen to me? And begin asking, what is this teaching me? That single shift turns pain into wisdom. It transforms endings into initiation. The wound that once demanded explanation slowly becomes a place of revelation. You begin to see that not every ending was unfair, some were necessary, some losses were the universe's way of clearing the path for what you truly deserve. And though it may ache, the absence becomes fertile ground for growth. In that emptiness, you discover your own strength. When closure no longer defines your healing, your heart begins to trust again, not because you forget, but because you no longer need to hold on. You learn that forgiveness isn't always about making peace with another person. Sometimes it's about making peace with yourself, for staying too long, for believing too much, for not knowing when to let go. You no longer seek justice from life, you seek understanding within yourself. This kind of freedom is not loud. It doesn't come with grand declarations or emotional outbursts. It comes quietly, almost invisibly, when you stop turning the past into a puzzle and start seeing it as a mirror. The lessons are still there, but the attachment is gone. You no longer wait for them to change, to understand, or to regret. You realize that their silence was the answer, their absence was the closure, their choice was the lesson. In letting go of your need to close the story, you finally step into the truth that every ending is self-contained. It carries its own completion when you stop resisting it. Closure is not something found at the end of the story. It's the quiet realization that the story was never meant to end perfectly, only truthfully. There was a time when your past felt like a battlefield, every memory a landmine, every regret an echo that refused to fade. You replayed old mistakes as if they were happening again. You searched for what you could have done differently, how you could have saved what was lost, or prevented what broke. You try to rewrite history in your mind, not realizing that the past was not demanding correction, it was asking for peace. Healing begins the moment you stop fighting what cannot be changed. When you're still at war with your past, your energy remains trapped in what was. You analyze conversations that ended years ago, revisit choices you made when you didn't know better, and hold yourself hostage to the standards of who you've become now. You forget that the person you were back then didn't have the wisdom you carry today. You were surviving with the tools you had, doing the best you could with the awareness available to you. The war starts to end when compassion enters the battlefield, when you stop judging your former self and start understanding them. There's a quiet power in looking back and saying, I forgive you for not knowing. It's not weakness, it's strength, because it means you've stopped trying to control the past through guilt. You've stopped weaponizing memory against yourself. Every time you revisit an old wound with softness instead of self-blame, you reclaim a piece of yourself that was lost in that moment. You're no longer reacting, you're integrating. That's what real healing looks like. Peace with the past doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It doesn't mean pretending you weren't hurt or denying the impact of what you went through. It means no longer allowing those memories to dictate how you live now. It means you've taken back the authority that pain once had over your present. The people who hurt you no longer have the same emotional power. The regrets that once defined you no longer shape your choices. You stopped living as a reaction to your history and started living as a response to your growth. You know you're no longer at war with your past when your triggers begin to soften, when the song that once shattered you now brings a quiet smile, when you can talk about what broke you without trembling, when your heart no longer rushes to defend itself from things that are long gone. That's not forgetfulness, that's integration. You've absorbed the lessons without carrying the suffering. Being at peace with your past also means allowing others to exist in their own timelines. You stop wishing they had acted differently, loved differently, or seen you more clearly. You understand that their behavior came from their own level of awareness, their own unhealed pain. You can acknowledge the harm without holding on to the hatred. You don't excuse what happened. You simply stop needing revenge, closure, or understanding. You realize that peace is something you give yourself, not something they can offer. When the war ends, silence feels different. It's not the silence of suppression, but the silence of release, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed, not because the storm forgot to rage, but because you stopped standing in its center. You've stopped returning to the same internal battlefield, expecting a different outcome. You've chosen to leave the ruins behind, not out of denial, but out of wisdom. There's a sacred maturity that emerges when you stop trying to rewrite what already taught you what you needed to learn. You begin to thank the very pain that once felt unbearable, not because it was good, but because it awakened depth within you. The war with your past was never about winning, it was about understanding. The moment you stopped fighting it, you realized there was nothing left to conquer, only something left to understand. There comes a stage in your healing where loneliness no longer feels like punishment, it begins to feel like purification. The noise of the world fades, and in that silence, something within you starts to rearrange itself. You are no longer surrounded by the people, distractions, and chaos that once filled every corner of your life. The external world grows quieter, but internally, something profound is awakening. You begin to sense that this loneliness is not emptiness, it's space being cleared for truth. At first, it feels disorienting. The people who once made you feel seen no longer understand you. The conversations that once lit you up now feel hollow. The places where you used to belong feel too small for who you are becoming. You find yourself drifting away from crowds, seeking meaning rather than company, silence rather than noise. This shift can feel like loss, but it's not. It's transformation. It's the moment your soul chooses depth over distraction. Loneliness becomes the sacred ground where your relationship with yourself begins to bloom. You start to hear your own voice, not the echo of other people's opinions or expectations. You realize how much of your past connection was built on fear. Fear of being alone, fear of rejection, fear of being unseen. You used to tolerate situations that drained your spirit just to avoid feeling abandoned. But now you sit in your solitude, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. You begin to understand that solitude is not absence. It is presence your own. There's a subtle but powerful difference between being lonely and being lost. Loneliness says, I am alone. Lostness says, I have no direction. You may feel the first, but not the second, because even in your solitude, you feel a quiet sense of alignment. You don't have all the answers, but you're no longer panicking about not having them. You've begun to trust the unseen path ahead. You realize that this in-between space, this pause, is not a mistake. It's where the soul recalibrates before it takes its next step. You feel lonely, but your loneliness has meaning now. It's no longer a void to be filled, but a mirror showing you how much you've grown. You start to notice how the things you used to chase no longer satisfy you. The attention, the approval, the validation, they no longer feel like nourishment. What you crave now is peace, depth, connection that feels like truth. You'd rather sit in silence than force small talk. You'd rather be misunderstood than betray your own authenticity just to fit in. This kind of loneliness is sacred because it reveals who you are without anyone's reflection. You see yourself clearly, your fears, your desires, your patterns. You start to enjoy your own company, to rediscover the parts of you that were buried beneath the noise of needing to belong. You find comfort in the smallest things, a quiet morning, a walk at sunset, the sound of your own breath. You begin to realize that peace has always been waiting beneath the noise, and you simply needed solitude to hear it. You stop viewing loneliness as a signal of lack and start recognizing it as a phase of integration. Your old identity is dissolving, and the new one hasn't fully taken form yet. That in-between feeling, that space where you're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming, is where the deepest growth happens. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's real. It's where authenticity begins. You start to see that solitude is not exile, it's evolution. It's the universe pulling you inward so you can learn to stand fully in your own light. The loneliness you feel is the echo of your old self fading away, making room for a stronger, quieter, truer version of you. You're not lost, you're being found, not by others, but by yourself. There's a kind of forgiveness that doesn't make noise. It doesn't need to be spoken, declared, or proven. It happens in silence, deep within the folds of the heart, where no one sees, not even the person being forgiven. It's the moment when you stop carrying the weight of what happened, not because it was fair, not because it was resolved, but because holding on has simply become too heavy. You no longer crave the drama of closure or the satisfaction of being right. You just let it go quietly, completely, without an audience. In the past, forgiveness may have felt like surrender, like losing the battle or diminishing your pain. You believed that to forgive meant to excuse, to condone, or to erase what someone did. But now you know the truth. Forgiveness is not for them, it's for you. It's not about rewriting what happened, it's about releasing what still lives inside you. It's not a transaction, it's a liberation. You forgive because peace is more valuable than pride, because your heart is ready to be free again. Forgiveness begins the moment you stop rehearsing the story. You no longer repeat it in your mind, trying to make sense of what went wrong or who should have done better. You stop building arguments that no one will ever hear. You no longer need the world to understand how deeply you were hurt. You simply decide that your healing matters more than being understood. The energy that once fueled anger slowly transforms into quiet acceptance. You begin to see the person who hurt you, not as a villain, but as someone still trapped in their own unconscious pain. When forgiveness deepens, you don't need to announce it. You don't need to tell them, I forgive you, because it's no longer about them knowing. The release is internal. It's something sacred between you and your own soul. You start noticing how your body feels lighter, how the resentment that used to live in your chest begins to dissolve. You can think of them without bitterness, remember the past without tension. The wound may still be there, but it no longer bleeds. That's when you know you're forgiven. This quiet forgiveness doesn't erase boundaries. You don't suddenly invite those people back into your life. You don't forget what they did, nor do you pretend it never happened. You simply stop needing to carry the emotional residue of it. You protect your peace without building walls of hatred. You can love someone from afar, wish them well, and still never let them close again. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, it means release. It means you no longer let their choices decide your emotional weather. You forgive without announcing it because you've learned that true peace doesn't need witnesses. You're no longer performing healing for anyone else. You don't forgive because you should or because you're trying to prove how evolved you are. You forgive because you're tired of dragging the weight of what can't be changed. The pain has already taken enough from you. It doesn't deserve the rest of your energy. In time, you begin to notice something remarkable. The things that once enraged you now evoke understanding. You see patterns, wounds, histories that explain, though never excuse what was done. You recognize that those who hurt you were also shaped by pain they never faced. You see humanity in the places where you once saw only harm. That's when compassion quietly enters, not as weakness, but as wisdom. It's a kind of compassion that doesn't require contact, only consciousness. To forgive without announcing it is to reclaim your soul from the grip of the past. It's to walk away not in bitterness, but in peace. It's when you realize that you can acknowledge the damage, honor the lesson, and still release the burden. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it's freedom. Forgiveness becomes a private revolution, one that no one sees, yet it changes everything within you. There comes a moment in your evolution when being understood by everyone no longer matters. It doesn't come from arrogance or indifference, it comes from peace. A deep, quiet acceptance that not everyone will see the world as you do, and that's okay. You stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop defending your choices, your healing, your silence. You realize that clarity was never meant to be shared with everyone sometimes. It's meant to be held privately, sacredly, within. In your earlier stages of growth, you may have tried desperately to be seen. You wanted people to understand your pain, your decisions, your truth. You wanted validation, not because you were weak, but because you were human. You wanted someone to say, I get it. So the burden of your inner world wouldn't feel so heavy. But as your awareness deepened, you began to understand something powerful. The need to be understood often comes from the parts of you still seeking permission to exist. When those parts finally heal, understanding becomes optional. You stop justifying your transformation. You no longer waste energy trying to explain why you walked away, why you changed, or why certain things no longer resonate with you. People who are meant to understand will feel your truth without needing an explanation. And those who don't, no amount of words will ever make them see. You begin to recognize that your energy is too sacred to be spent proving your soul's journey to someone who has never walked your path. Not needing to be understood doesn't mean closing your heart. It means opening it to something larger, to acceptance, to the beauty of difference, to the freedom of not being controlled by perception. You start to value inner alignment over external approval. You can stand alone in your truth, calm and centered, without the constant urge to correct others' opinions of you. You understand that how others see you is a reflection of their own consciousness, not your worth. You stop oversharing your pain just to make people believe it was real. You stop explaining your silence just to make it acceptable. You stop diluting your truth to make it digestible. The more you honor your inner world, the more you realize that not everyone deserves access to it. Some people will only understand from the level of their own wounds, and that's no longer your responsibility to fix. There's a serenity that comes when you stop trying to make everyone see your point of view. You start listening more and defending less. You observe rather than react. You recognize that peace doesn't come from being right, it comes from being free. Free from the compulsion to prove, to persuade, to perform. You realize that the truth you carry doesn't need witnesses to be real, it simply is. In this space, your relationships shift, conversations become lighter, even when they're deep. You no longer need agreement to feel connected. You allow others to hold their own perspectives without taking it as a personal threat. You learn to coexist with difference, not through compromise, but through understanding that alignment doesn't require sameness. You start to love people as they are, not as you need them to see you. And somewhere in that acceptance, you feel something you hadn't felt before, liberation. The kind that comes when you stop chasing validation and start living in your authenticity. You speak when it feels true, not when it feels necessary. You stay silent when words would only create noise. You no longer need to be seen to know that you exist. You no longer need to be understood to know that you are right where you are meant to be. There was a time when chaos felt like home, when intensity was mistaken for love and arguments felt like connection. The highs and lows gave you a sense of aliveness, and the silence in between felt unbearable. You didn't realize it then, but your nervous system had been trained by trauma to equate peace with danger. Stillness felt foreign, almost threatening, because the calm was never safe in your past. But slowly, as you began to heal, that began to change. The more you returned to yourself, the more peace started to feel natural and drama began to feel exhausting. When you live in survival mode for too long, chaos becomes addictive. You crave the rush of adrenaline that comes from tension, conflict, or emotional unpredictability. You unconsciously attract situations that mirror that intensity because it feels familiar. Peace, on the other hand, feels uncomfortable at first, too quiet, too stable, too unfamiliar. You start to wonder if something is wrong simply because nothing is wrong. But the truth is, nothing is wrong. You're just detoxing from the emotional chaos that once defined your sense of normal. Healing teaches you to find safety in stillness. You begin to notice the beauty of uneventful days, the soft rhythm of ordinary life. You start to enjoy mornings without anxiety, conversations without hidden tension, love without turbulence. It's not boring, it's stable. It's the kind of stability your younger self never knew was possible. And though at first it may feel strange, over time it begins to feel like home. The drama that once excited you now feels heavy. The people who thrive on conflict begin to drain your energy. You no longer feel the urge to participate in every argument or prove your side of the story. You've learned that silence can be stronger than reaction, and walking away can be wiser than winning. You realize that peace doesn't come from avoiding problems, it comes from not creating unnecessary ones. As your nervous system calms, you start to recognize how much of your old identity was tied to struggle. You thought your strength came from enduring storms, but now you see it comes from not inviting them. You no longer romanticize chaos as passion. You crave emotional safety more than intensity, grounding more than excitement. You choose relationships where calm communication replaces confrontation, where honesty replaces games, where consistency replaces unpredictability. Peace becomes your new baseline. It's not that life suddenly becomes free of challenges, it's that you stop interpreting every challenge as a crisis. You handle situations with clarity, not reactivity. You respond instead of react. You pause before you speak, breathe before you decide, and listen before you assume. The stillness that once felt awkward now feels powerful. It gives you space to think, to feel, to be present. There's a deep wisdom in realizing that you don't need chaos to feel alive. You begin to understand that peace isn't the absence of emotion, it's the mastery of it. You still feel deeply, but you no longer drown in those feelings. You've learned to regulate rather than explode, to observe rather than absorb. That balance is what maturity feels like. It's when peace stops being an ideal and starts being your natural state. The world around you may still be noisy, but you don't absorb it anymore. You no longer chase validation through drama or attention through conflict. You choose quiet over clamor, truth over reaction, depth over distraction. You realize that peace doesn't need to be earned, it only needs to be protected. You stop explaining it to those who mistake calm for coldness, because you know that peace isn't a sign of detachment, it's a sign of evolution. You finally feel safe in the absence of chaos, and for the first time, tranquility feels like your truest self. There comes a moment in every transformation when the person you once were starts to feel like a stranger. You look back at old photos, old messages, old memories, and it feels like watching someone else's life. You can recognize the face, the choices, the emotions, but something deep within you no longer identifies with them. The old version of you, the one who tolerated too much, explained too much, tried too hard, no longer feels like home. And while that realization can feel both freeing and lonely, it's also proof that you've evolved. Growth is rarely glamorous. It doesn't announce itself in shining moments of clarity. It arrives quietly, disguised as discomfort. You start to notice that the things you used to enjoy now leave you feeling empty. The relationships that once felt essential now drain your energy. The patterns that used to define your days no longer align with your soul. You can't go back, even if you tried, because that version of you no longer exists in the same way. You've outgrown the space that once felt safe. At first, this change feels like loss. You might grieve the old self, the one who found comfort in familiar pain, who built identity around survival, who didn't know any better but kept trying anyway. You might miss their innocence, their illusions, their hope. But as you sit with that grief, you begin to understand that version of you was necessary. They carried you through storms. They made choices with limited awareness. They were the bridge between who you were and who you are now. You can thank them without needing to return to them. The old you was built on the foundation of what you knew at the time, on beliefs, fears, and defense mechanisms that helped you feel safe. But healing has a way of exposing how temporary those foundations were. You begin to see that what once protected you now restricts you. The armor that kept you from breaking is now too heavy to keep carrying. So you start shedding habits, identities, even relationships that reflect the version of you you're leaving behind. It's uncomfortable, but necessary. Transformation requires release. You no longer resonate with conversations that revolve around gossip, competition, or drama. You crave depth, not distraction. You prefer solitude over company that drains you. You start to make choices that don't make sense to others, but make perfect sense to your soul. The more you honor your truth, the more distant your old self feels. The old triggers lose their power. The old fears fade into background noise. The old definitions of success, love, and happiness no longer fit your new awareness. This stage of growth can feel like floating detached from who you were, not yet fully anchored in who you're becoming. It's the in-between space where you're rebuilding your sense of self from the inside out. You might feel misunderstood, isolated, or even guilty for changing. But that's only because the people and patterns that matched your old vibration can no longer reach you at your new one. You're not abandoning your past, you're outgrowing it. There's a quiet beauty in realizing that you can't go back to pretending. You can't unsee what you've seen, unlearn what you've learned, or unknow the truth that awakened within you. The old version of you sought belonging, the new version seeks authenticity. The old you wanted to be loved for fitting in, the new you wants to be loved for standing true. You've learned that peace isn't found in familiarity, it's found in alignment. When the old version of you no longer feels like home, it's not a sign that you're lost. It's a sign that you've stepped into the threshold of rebirth. You've expanded beyond the walls of your old identity. And what once comforted you now constrains you. You may not know exactly who you're becoming yet, but you know you can't go back, and that's how you know you're finally becoming who you were always meant to be.